Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Whether you're tuning in from a quiet porch, a bustling workshop, or just catching your breath after a long day, we're glad you're here. Tonight's story isn't about shouting matches or political noise. It's about a young woman who stepped into one of the toughest rooms in America and stood her ground. It's a story of courage, conviction, and the kind of quiet strength we don't see enough of anymore. So settle in, because what unfolded on that stage in Nashville may just remind you of what leadership really looks like. In a country growing louder by the day, where truth is shouted down by slogans and loyalty is mistaken for blind allegiance, a moment of quiet clarity was long overdue. The year was marked by media skirmishes and public mistrust, where every press conference felt like a courtroom and every interview a war zone. The divisions weren't just political, they were generational, cultural, and personal. In this storm stood Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. Just 27 years old, but already a lightning rod for criticism. Some called her a mouthpiece, others a rising star, but labels were cheap. What mattered now was what she'd say when the spotlight found her, not behind a protected podium in D.C., but under the arched rafters of a Tennessee landmark steeped in American legacy. The Ryman Auditorium in Nashville had hosted country legends and civil rights leaders, sermons and protests, and now it would host a different kind of performance, one without music, where the instrument was words and the stakes were trust. With media figure Jimmy Kimmel set to moderate and civic leaders watching closely, the stage was more than symbolic, it was sacred. Would this be just another media moment, or would Karoline Leavitt, under pressure and against the grain, rise to meet something older than politics itself, the quiet test of principle, poise, and the kind of truth that doesn't come with applause? In an era obsessed with going viral, this night wouldn't be about clicks, it would be about conviction. The Ryman didn't need an introduction, it was carved into the memory of every man who'd ever held a respect for legacy. Built in 1892 and nicknamed the Mother Church of Country Music, its wooden pews had heard the voices of Johnny Cash, Elvis, even presidents. But tonight, it wasn't music that filled the air, it was anticipation. Voices of America, the televised town hall, wasn't a campaign rally or a cable news segment, it was something different. A quiet battleground, the kind where every word echoed louder than applause, and every pause meant something. Red, white, and blue spotlights crossed over the stage in deliberate restraint, casting long shadows that reached across the original pine floorboards, worn by time, but not weakened. Rows of guests began to settle in. Veterans with folded arms, students with notepads, small business owners in worn jackets, and retired professionals who remembered what political courage used to look like. There was no laugh track here, no teleprompters. Just microphones, notebooks, and the weight of expectation. Cameras were mounted, but unobtrusive, meant to record, not distort. On the center left sat Jimmy Kimmel, invited not as a comedian but as a cultural moderator, a sharp-tongued observer now walking a finer line. On the opposite side, a reserved podium stood ready for Karoline Leavitt, the youngest voice in the building but perhaps the most tested. Towering in presence and history, the Ryman demanded more than talking points, it demanded character. Above the stage hung a single phrase, projected in gold script: "Truth deserves a stage." The audience hushed as the orchestra lights dimmed. It wasn't just the beginning of a broadcast, it was the threshold of something harder to define. What was about to unfold would not be comfortable. It would be sharp, divided, and deeply revealing. But that was the point. In a time when most conversations took place behind screens or in rage-filled headlines, tonight's dialogue would be eye to eye, mic on, and unfiltered. And that, in itself, felt like a return to something this country hadn't seen in far too long: the courage to listen and the grit to answer. The double doors at stage right opened with a soft creak, and all eyes turned. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the light, not with fanfare, not with swagger, but with the stillness of someone who knew she was walking into a fight that wasn't entirely hers, but one she'd own anyway. At 27, she looked out of place by age alone, but her bearings said otherwise. Dressed in a dark navy blazer with a single American flag pin over her heart, her heels clicked once, twice, then softened as she crossed onto the wooden stage. The hush in the room wasn't silence, it was calculation. The veterans in the third row watched her like they'd watched lieutenants earn stripes. A retired judge in the front leaned forward slightly. Even Jimmy Kimmel, polished, practiced, tilted his head, measuring. Karoline didn't glance his way. Not yet. She paused at her podium, adjusted the mic, and scanned the room, not for the cameras, but for the people. She saw them all. Skeptical faces, polite nods, a few supportive eyes. She didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she nodded once, as if to say, "I see you, let's begin." She cleared her throat and began with a simple sentence that would later be quoted in headlines and dissected in living rooms. "I didn't come here to be liked. I came here to be honest." That was the moment. Not a zinger, not a viral line, just a line in the sand. And that's when something shifted. Not applause, not cheering, but attention. Real, focused, adult attention. This wasn't a girl with a title. This was a woman stepping into the furnace with her name, her voice, and her purpose, and she wasn't waiting for permission to speak. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward in his chair, legs crossed, fingers tapping the cue cards that lay loosely in his lap. The crowd sensed it before he spoke. This was the beginning of the real game. He offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, Karoline," he began, his voice laced with polite sarcasm, "at 27, you're the youngest White House press secretary in history. That's impressive. Tell me, do they still have to check your ID before letting you into the Situation Room?" A few scattered laughs broke out, nothing wild, just enough to test the waters. Karoline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, resting her hands on the podium, with practiced calm. "They don't check my ID, Jimmy," she replied, "but I check the facts, daily." A ripple ran through the room. Not a roar, but a shifting of weight, of attention. Eleanor Finch, seated between them as the event's civic co-moderator, raised one eyebrow and made a small mark in her notebook. Kimmel chuckled, brushing it off, but the edge had already dulled slightly, and he tried again. "So, what's it like being the spokesperson for someone who tweets more than he sleeps?" Another laugh line, delivered with his signature blend of charm and condescension. Karoline's answer was calm, almost surgical. "It's not about tweets, Jimmy, it's about policy and impact. And if I wanted to be popular on social media, I'd be sitting in your chair." This time the audience reacted louder. Some chuckled, a few clapped, and one man near the back nodded slowly, arms crossed. The first volley had been fired, and Karoline hadn't just deflected. She'd parried and countered without ever raising her voice. What became clear in that moment was this. Karoline wasn't playing to win a popularity contest. She wasn't here for applause or internet points. She was here to show a different kind of strength. The kind that didn't flinch, didn't retreat, and didn't answer a jab with a grin, but with a grounded truth. And for a room full of men who'd lived long enough to know the difference, that truth carried weight. Before Jimmy could line up his next question, a voice rose from the third row, calm, deep, and weathered. "Can I say something?" The cameras turned, as did the crowd. A tall man with a shaved head and a navy pin on his lapel stood up. His name tag read, Tommy Rourke, 65, former Marine, 2 tours in Fallujah. The room gave way to him instinctively. Karoline turned to face him fully, giving the floor without hesitation. "I didn't come here to heckle," Tommy began, voice steady but resolute. "And I sure didn't come here for jokes. I came because I've got a son buried at Arlington and another one trying to raise a family on a mechanic's wage. Both served. One came home with a flag on his chest. The other came back to a country he barely recognizes." He looked directly at Karoline. "I want to know, what exactly are you doing to keep this country worth serving for?" You could hear the audience breathe. Jimmy sat back in his chair, quiet now. Even Eleanor Finch put down her pen. Karoline stepped forward from her podium. Not much, just enough to close the distance without taking over. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice softer than it had been all night. "First, thank you. Not just for your service, but for your courage to ask what most people only whisper." She paused, steadying herself before continuing. Last spring I met with a Gold Star widow in Virginia. Her husband died stopping a cartel convoy near the border. She told me he died so someone else's child wouldn't have to. That stayed with me. Every policy I defend, every word I speak from that podium, it's with him in mind. She glanced at Jimmy, then back to Rourke. You asked what I'm doing. I'm making sure your son's sacrifice isn't filtered through politics. I'm standing where I am not because it's easy, but because I want the next generation to grow up in a country where truth is protected, where borders matter, and where service still means something. Tommy didn't clap, he just nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said, then sat down. The room didn't erupt, and that was the power of it. No roar, no hashtags, just a moment of real connection, man to woman, veteran to citizen, father to patriot. And for an audience full of men who'd lived the weight of duty and loss, that was the first moment Karoline Leavitt truly arrived, not as a spokesperson, but as someone who understood what the job really meant. The silence left by Tommy Rourke's words lingered like the echo of a folded flag. But Jimmy Kimmel, ever the professional, knew when to strike, and, more importantly, when to shift gears. He straightened in his seat, voice steady but pointed. Karoline, I appreciate your answer, he said, but let's move from stories to statements. You work for someone who doesn't just stir the pot. He flips the whole table. A few weeks ago, President Trump said, and I quote, "We need a strong America, unviolated by outsiders." Jimmy held up a printed sheet for effect. That doesn't sound like border policy. That sounds like a purity test. And you retweeted it. A low murmur passed through the room. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward. Karoline didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, let it settle, then stepped forward. I did, she said, because I believe in the principle behind it, not the spin wrapped around it. Her voice was calm, almost too calm for the weight of the moment. Jimmy pressed, You don't think unviolated by outsiders is dangerous language? Karoline met his eyes without blinking. What's dangerous, Jimmy, is the way we've stopped distinguishing between language meant to protect and language twisted to provoke outrage. The phrase you just quoted, what did it mean to you? Jimmy blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It meant exclusion, he said. It meant fear. Karoline nodded, and to the widow I mentioned earlier, it meant safety. It meant sovereignty. It meant her husband didn't die for open borders and hashtags. He died defending a line we used to agree mattered. The audience stayed quiet, but they were no longer still. A few heads nodded. One man near the aisle whispered something to his wife. Jimmy leaned forward again, now choosing precision over sarcasm. But don't you think your job, your real job, is to clarify when your boss says things that set the country on fire? Karoline didn't retreat. My job, she said, is to speak truth, not to coddle perception. We've reached a point where you can say secure the border and be called a bigot, but say smash the system and be labeled brave. I won't play that game. I didn't come here to sell safe sound bites. I came here to speak clearly. There was a pause, not awkward, just loaded. Eleanor Finch, ever the measured voice of the room, finally leaned in. Language matters, Ms. Leavitt. So does tone. Karoline turned to her. Agreed. That's why I chose mine carefully. Kimmel tried once more, shifting the frame. You say you won't play games, but you're defending someone who's made a career out of inflammatory rhetoric. Doesn't that make you, at best, a translator of chaos and at worst, complicit? That was the sharpest strike yet, and for a moment the room waited to see if she'd finally slip, but Karoline simply folded her hands and said, I'm not a translator, I'm a filter. A filter for facts. Because when the media takes half a quote and builds a fire around it, somebody needs to stand in the middle and say, that's not smoke, it's steam. Scattered applause broke out, a few louder claps from the back. Jimmy leaned back, the edges of his smile curling again. But this time, it wasn't confidence. It was recognition. The young woman in front of him hadn't cracked. She'd just raised the temperature. Before the next question could come from Jimmy or the co-moderator, a hand shot up near the middle of the audience. It wasn't a media hand or a veteran's. It was a student badge that caught the light. Eleanor Finch nodded toward the young woman, recognizing her from the pre-screened audience list. "Go ahead, Ms. Chen," the girl stood. Early 20s, glasses, denim jacket with a university patch. Voice trembling slightly but determined. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, "you talk a lot about truth and duty and I respect that, but I'm Gen Z too and I feel like you're using our name without speaking for us." The room stiffened. Maya Chen didn't say it with malice, but it carried the kind of accusation that cuts deep. "You defend a president who mocks movements we believe in, climate, equity, voting rights. So who exactly are you representing up there, us or him?" It was the first challenge that didn't come wrapped in sarcasm or partisan fire. It was raw, personal. Karoline didn't rush to respond. She stepped forward, hands resting lightly on the podium, and looked directly at Maya. "Thank you for asking that," she said sincerely. "And let me start here. I don't speak for Gen Z, I speak as Gen Z. We're not one voice, we're not a monolith. We're messy, loud, passionate, and completely unafraid to disagree with each other. And that's good." She paused just long enough to let it settle. "You don't have to agree with my politics to respect why I'm here. I didn't come to parrot tweets or chase approval. I came because someone needs to remind us that service isn't a trend, it's a commitment. You're right to ask hard questions. That's your job. Mine is to answer them, not with slogans, but with spine." Maya didn't sit immediately. She nodded slowly, then returned to her seat, and for a few seconds the audience held its breath. Karoline hadn't dodged. She hadn't pandered. She stood her ground and opened the door to a broader truth. That leadership wasn't about being liked. It was about being clear. For the older men in the room, many of whom had once been young men facing questions of war, duty, and identity, it was the kind of answer they hadn't heard in a long time, and it stuck. Jimmy Kimmel adjusted his mic, fingers drumming slowly against the edge of his armrest. The room had shifted, less theater now, more trial. He glanced down at a set of papers, then held one up. "Karoline," he said, his tone more deliberate now, less amused, "you've done a masterful job answering questions tonight. Measured, poised. But let's cut through it. Because eventually all of this comes down to one question." He paused, letting the moment ripen. "When your boss, President Trump, uses phrases like clean up the country or calls certain regions unfit, and you stand up at that podium defending him, don't you ever wonder if you're just polishing something that can't be cleaned?" A few gasps echoed faintly. A man in the front row crossed his arms tighter. Another cleared his throat, uneasy. Jimmy continued, pressing in. "You've stood here tonight and made the case for national security, for borders, for law and order. But there's another case too, the case that maybe, just maybe, you've become the smiling face of something that isn't just controversial, but dangerous." It was a swing, a heavy one, and it landed with precision. Karoline didn't move at first. She kept her hands folded, eyes steady, the silence around her building like air before thunder. Then slowly she leaned into the microphone, not with fire, but with clarity. "Jimmy," she said, voice firm, "do you think I haven't asked myself that question?" She let it sit. "I ask it every morning before I walk into that building. I ask it when I see my name trending on social media, and I ask it when I meet the families who've lost more than their patients. They've lost sons, daughters, jobs, dignity. And you know what I keep coming back to?" Her voice rose, not in volume but in weight. "I keep coming back to the fact that courage isn't about standing in front of applause. It's about standing in front of fire and still speaking. Not because it's easy, not because it's safe, but because silence is worse." She turned slightly toward the crowd, speaking now not to Jimmy, but to every listener in the room. "I've been called a mouthpiece, a puppet, a political stunt, but here's what I'm not. I'm not afraid, I'm not confused, and I'm not for sale. I don't get to pick the perfect boss or the perfect quote. I get to pick how I show up when the storm hits." Jimmy leaned forward again, not backing down. "But isn't that just spin with polish? You're defending a man who's been called a lot of things, racist included. You stand by that?" The audience tensed. One man whispered, "Here it comes." Another looked away, bracing. Karoline didn't blink. "I stand by truth," she said. "And the truth is, President Trump says things others won't. Sometimes raw, sometimes blunt. But I'd rather work for a man who speaks without fear than for a system that lies with a smile." Kimmel arched an eyebrow. "So you're okay with all of it? The tweets, the insults, the headlines?" Karoline leaned in again. "I'm not paid to be okay. I'm paid to be honest. And when the media twists words for ratings, and talk show hosts turn policy into punchlines, someone has to be the firewall." A low rumble of applause started at the back of the room. Older voices, steadier hands, men who'd seen their share of politics, but knew conviction when they heard it. Jimmy wasn't done. "So you're saying your loyalty is a virtue?" She smiled now, just barely, but it wasn't smug, it was controlled. "No, I'm saying loyalty without thinking is blindness, but thinking without loyalty is cowardice. I've chosen my side not because it's clean or easy, but because I believe in this country, even when it's messy." For a full 5 seconds no one spoke, even Jimmy sat still. That was the breaking point, not because Karoline erupted, but because she didn't. She had taken the hardest hit of the night and responded not with outrage, but with something harder to dismiss: principle. For the men in the room, it wasn't about politics anymore, it was about posture. She hadn't folded, she'd braced herself, answered the storm, and stayed standing. The tension in the room hadn't faded, it had simply changed form. What once felt like a battle of sound bites had shifted into something deeper, more reflective. Jimmy Kimmel, still seated but no longer leaning forward with the same sharpness, adjusted his collar and exhaled. The camera caught his expression, part skeptical, part respectful, entirely watchful. Then he spoke. "All right, Karoline," he said, "quieter now. You've answered the hard stuff, you've taken the heat, but here's what I really want to know, and I think a lot of folks at home want this too. When all this is over, whether it's 4 years or 40, what's your legacy going to be?" He paused, locking eyes with her. "Are you going to be remembered as a loyal soldier who defended the indefensible, or as a smart young woman who got caught in the gears of something bigger than herself?" The question didn't land like a punch, it landed like a verdict. Final, heavy, not cruel, just honest. Karoline didn't look away. She didn't laugh, deflect, or pivot. Instead, she stepped around the side of her podium, closing the space between her and the audience, not physically, but emotionally. Her voice came low, almost like a conversation around a fire. "My grandfather," she began, "fought in Korea. Came home and started a hardware store with 2 hands and a promise he made to his brother in a trench. If I make it back, I'll build something. That store is still standing. He never ran for office. He never made headlines. But to this day in my family, we talk about his word like it was a sacred thing." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Men in ball caps, folded arms, veterans with steady eyes. "Legacy," she continued, "isn't built by applause. It's built by consistency, by the decisions you make when the cameras go off. If people want to call me a mouthpiece, they can. But here's the truth. I showed up when it mattered. I stood in front of fire and didn't run. I chose duty over comfort. I chose clarity over popularity. And if that makes me a soldier in someone else's war, so be it. I'd rather fall on my feet than rise on a lie." She let the silence carry the weight of her words. Then, softer now, "This job isn't about rewriting history. It's about not running from it. I'll make mistakes, like anyone. But when I stand in front of that press room, or here, in front of you, I answer to something bigger than a headline. I answered to the men and women who built something and kept showing up for it, even when no one was clapping." The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. A few men nodded, lips pressed, one whispered to another, "That's the old way. That's how we used to talk." Even Jimmy sat back, his expression unreadable for once. He didn't smile, he didn't interrupt. Karoline's final words hung in the air, simple and unmoving. "I'm not building a brand, I'm building a spine. That's my legacy." And in a room that had heard hundreds of speeches, thousands of promises, it was that last line, quiet, almost defiant, that stayed behind. Not flashy, not loud, just solid, like something worth standing on. The moment Karoline's final words fell silent, the room didn't break into instant applause. It held its breath. For a few seconds, no one moved, like they were collectively measuring the cost of what had just been said. Then, slowly, a ripple began. It wasn't the raucous kind of reaction that cameras crave. It was deeper, quieter, more meaningful. A veteran in the third row nodded, lips tight. A retired union foreman near the back murmured to his wife. She didn't blink once. One by one, the audience leaned back, not out of detachment, but out of processing. Karoline hadn't played to them. She hadn't begged for approval. She had simply laid down her truth and left it where it landed. Jimmy Kimmel, for his part, didn't fire back. He shifted in his seat, resting his elbow on the armrest and offering a glance that hovered somewhere between curiosity and reluctant respect. He tapped his pen once against the notepad in front of him, but said nothing. For once, the man who usually had the last word didn't seem in a rush to take it. Eleanor Finch, ever the measured observer, leaned toward her mic and said softly, "Well spoken, Ms. Leavitt. Whether folks agree or not, courage still looks like that." The audience began to applaud, this time more steadily, more unified. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sustained. The applause wasn't for a performance, it was for resolve, for backbone, for a young woman who hadn't backed down when every reason to retreat was laid before her. In that moment, the room didn't see a spokesperson. They saw something harder to define. Maybe conviction, maybe grit, maybe just someone willing to stand still while the wind blew hard. And perhaps most telling of all, no one looked at their phones. No one scrambled to post or tweet. They just watched, listened, sat in the aftershock of a conversation that, for once, felt real, the kind of real that lingers after the lights go down. And in the quiet, some of them, especially the older men who had come expecting little, left carrying more than they expected. Not answers, perhaps, but a question worth thinking about. What would I have said if it were me at that podium? Would I have stood that still, that firm, under fire? The silence carried the weight. When the lights dimmed inside the Ryman Auditorium, it wasn't the kind of ending that made headlines with sound bites or viral clips. It was quieter than that, and somehow more lasting. Karoline Leavitt stepped down from the stage, without waving, without turning for the camera, and certainly without soaking in applause. She simply walked, heels steady against the aged wooden floorboards, past the shadows of legends and echoes of old debates. A staffer handed her a water bottle backstage, whispering, "You did it." Karoline nodded, not out of pride, but as if she'd just closed a chapter only she had known the weight of. Her expression wasn't triumphant, it was resolved. She didn't smile, she exhaled. Out in the crowd, the conversation continued, not in outrage, but in reflection. A middle-aged man in a veteran's cap spoke to his son, who'd brought him to the event. "You don't have to agree with her," he said, "but that girl's got more spine than half the folks in Washington." In another aisle, two retired steel workers who hadn't clapped much throughout the night now sat in silence, replaying her words. "Not building a brand, building a spine," one muttered. "Hell of a line." A small group lingered in the lobby, not to grab selfies or rush the door, but to talk about leadership, legacy, and how rare it had become to hear someone speak without dodging. On cable news, coverage split fast. CNN aired a clip of the loyalty exchange with the chyron defiant or delusional. Fox News cut to her answer on legacy and ran with Karoline Leavitt, a star with steel. On social media, reaction was predictably fractured. Gen Z influencers posted split-screen edits praising her confidence, while progressive accounts called her just another polished defender of power. But inside those circles of noise, something else was happening, especially among older viewers who'd grown tired of watching leaders dodge, deflect, or dance around the truth. In living rooms across the country, the night's conversation lingered. It was the kind of moment that men remembered from their younger days, when someone stood in the fire, not shouting, not pandering, just standing. Not perfect, not polished, but present, real. A high school civics teacher in Ohio used the full broadcast in his classroom the next day, telling students, "This isn't about who's right or left. This is about how you carry yourself when the room turns on you." In Florida, a retired Marine Corps colonel texted the clip to his grandson, "Watch this. It's how you lead when you're outnumbered." Karoline didn't release a flashy statement after the town hall. No morning talk show follow-ups, no spin. Just a single post on X 12 hours later. "We don't rise to the level of our comfort. We rise to the level of our commitment. Thank you, Nashville. Onward." It wasn't a mic drop, it was a mission continued. For the audience that watched that night, and especially for the men who'd carried the weight of wars, families, and decades of change, it wasn't about whether they agreed with every policy she defended. It was about something simpler and harder. Could they see themselves, years ago, standing as she had? Would they have had the guts? Could they, even now? The answers weren't clear, but the respect was. And that, in the end, was the legacy already in motion, not a campaign slogan, not a viral moment, just a young woman who showed up, stood her ground, and walked off stage with her spine and her word intact. The story of Karoline Leavitt at the Ryman Auditorium teaches us that true leadership isn't about winning applause. It's about standing firm when it would be easier to retreat. In an age dominated by noise, spin, and carefully curated performances, Karoline chose clarity over charisma, substance over spectacle. She didn't try to be everything to everyone. She didn't soften her stance or seek comfort in popularity. Instead, she answered tough questions with composure, acknowledged the weight of her role, and spoke from a place of conviction, whether the crowd agreed with her or not. For the older generation watching, men who've weathered decades of cultural shifts, wars, economic battles, and broken politics, Karoline's message resonated. Not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. She reminded us that legacy isn't built in headlines or hashtags. It's built when you show up, hold the line, and refuse to let others define your principles for you. The lesson is simple but powerful. In a world obsessed with image, don't chase approval. Chase integrity. Your spine, not your brand, is what people remember, and sometimes the most meaningful victories are the ones no one sees, except the man you face in the mirror.